She stole that uniform. My father's voice cracked through the Fairfax County courtroom like a rifle shot. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Not the clerk, not the bailiff, not even Judge Robert Halstead, whose reading glasses had frozen halfway down his nose as he stared over the bench at the man shouting from the plaintiff's table. My father stood trembling, one finger pointed straight at my chest. The gold trim on my navy dress whites caught the afternoon light from the courthouse windows, bright enough to sting the eye. "That woman is a fraud," he barked. "She stole that uniform, and she's trying to steal my family's land." Whispers rippled through the gallery. I heard my name pass from mouth to mouth like a rumor too scandalous to keep quiet. Abigail Mercer. Frank Mercer's runaway daughter. The girl who'd vanished 12 years ago and come back wearing honors no one in Cedar Ridge, Virginia, believed she'd earned. I kept my face still. That had taken years to learn. You don't survive military service by reacting to every insult thrown your way. You learn stillness. Stillness unnerves people. Across the aisle, my younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, wearing the same crooked smile he'd had at 16 when he'd framed me for breaking the tail light on his truck. Something's never changed. Judge Halstead cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer, this is a court of law, not your church social hall. Sit down." Father lowered himself slowly, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. Pale blue, the same shade as mine, though his had long ago hardened into something cold and suspicious. For a moment I saw him exactly as he'd looked the day I left. Standing on the farmhouse porch, jaw clenched, telling me if I walked away to join the Navy, I needn't bother coming back. That had been 12 years ago. Long enough for my mother to die. Long enough for Daniel to inherit Father's easy affection. Long enough for me to become someone neither of them could imagine. My attorney, Margaret Bell, rose from beside me. At 72, she'd spent 4 decades practicing law in Virginia, and had stared down enough judges and self-important local men to qualify as a regional natural disaster. Nothing rattled her. "Your Honor, if the plaintiff is finished with theatrics, the defense would like to proceed." She laid out the facts plainly. Eleanor Mercer had amended her will 6 months before her death, granting equal ownership of the Cedar Ridge property to both her children. Father's claim that the amendment was forged died the moment Margaret produced notarized copies and corroborating testimony. Then came the harder blow. Father said I'd been absent for over a decade. No calls, no visits, no attendance at my own mother's funeral. That one landed. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it. A quiet blade turning where old grief still lived. I hadn't missed her funeral by choice. I'd been halfway around the world on orders I couldn't break and missions I couldn't name. By the time the message reached me, she was already buried beneath the maple tree she'd chosen herself. Father knew that. Or he'd chosen not to. Judge Halstead frowned. "Mrs. Bell, unless you can provide documentation." The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A young Marine courier stepped inside carrying a sealed navy blue dispatch envelope stamped in red. "Urgent. Eyes only." He crossed directly to Margaret's table, saluted me crisply, and handed her the envelope. No expression. No hesitation. Just duty. Margaret walked it to the bench as calmly as if she'd expected him. Because she had. The judge broke the Pentagon seal. The first line hit his eyes and everything changed. The color drained from his face. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Robert Halstead stood. Then he reached up and removed his robe. The gallery gasped. Even Daniel sat forward. Halstead folded the robe over the back of his chair with military precision. Then he looked directly at me. "All rise." My father's face went pale. "Wait," he whispered. "What?" The bailiff rose first, broad-shouldered despite his years. Then the clerk. Then the gallery. Then Daniel. And finally my father slowly, his face so pale I thought he might collapse. I stayed seated. Judge Halstead looked at me, not as a judge, not even as a fellow Virginian, but as one service member recognizing another. Then he gave the slightest nod. Only then did I stand. It lasted 5 seconds. No one said a word. Then Halstead sat, pulled his robe back on, and the spell broke. His eyes settled on my father. Mr. Mercer, you would be wise to remain silent until this court has reviewed all evidence. During recess, Margaret led me to a narrow consultation room off the main hall. She closed the door, let out a long breath, and reached into her briefcase. She withdrew a sealed manila envelope, yellowed slightly with age. My name written across it in my mother's careful script. I stared at it. I've held on to this for 6 years, Margaret said quietly, per your mother's instructions. She told me to give it to you only if your father ever forced this matter into open court. Even dead, my mother had seen farther ahead than anyone else. I opened it. A single handwritten letter. Abigail, if you're reading this, then your father has chosen pride over love again. I prayed he would not. But prayer does not erase a man's nature. 6 months before I died, Frank came to me desperate. Daniel had mortgaged portions of the Mercer land through speculative investments he did not fully understand. When those ventures failed, your father covered the losses with additional debt. They needed your share of the property to keep creditors from forcing a sale. That is why I changed my will. Not to punish your father. Not even to protect the land. I changed it to protect you. Mercy does not mean surrender. Love does not require permission. And your worth was never his to grant. I love you always, Mother. My vision blurred. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Margaret. How bad is it? Very. She opened a folder. Bank statements. Property liens. Refinancing records. The Mercer Company was nearly insolvent. Daniel had leveraged inflated crop contracts to secure private loans, then doubled down when commodity prices dropped. Family land was collateral for $0.8 million in hidden debt. There it was. The real reason for this lawsuit. Not wounded pride. Desperation. My father had accused me of fraud in open court because he needed one final signature to save himself. A small humorless laugh escaped me. All those years I believed he hated me because I disappointed him. But the truth was simpler and stranger than that. He'd needed to destroy my credibility before anyone could look closely at his own. Margaret watched me. There's one more thing. She withdrew another document, a Pentagon release order. 6 weeks ago, portions of your overseas service record were declassified. The extraction mission. The embassy siege in Izmir. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 41 civilians evacuated under live hostile fire, she said. It's public now. Enough of it is. I understood then. Not just what was in Judge Halstead's envelope, but what was about to happen. My father had built this entire case on the assumption that no one could prove who I was. He had gambled everything on secrecy, and secrecy had just expired. When we stepped back into the courtroom, the noise died at once. The gallery had grown during recess. Word had spread. Local attorneys stood along the back wall pretending they had business nearby. Mrs. Chandler from the diner clutched her purse like she was attending Sunday service. Old Sheriff Collins stood near the door, unreadable beneath his white mustache. My father sat rigid, smaller somehow. Judge Halstead entered and the room came to order. This court has reviewed documentation submitted under federal authority by the United States Department of Defense. His voice filled the room. The plaintiff's claim that Abigail Mercer fraudulently impersonated a commissioned naval officer is categorically false. Daniel's face went gray. My father stared straight ahead. Halstead adjusted his glasses and read from the release. On March 14, 2020, Commander Mercer assumed field command after the incapacitation of senior leadership during hostile engagement at the United States Diplomatic Annex. Commander Mercer directed evacuation protocols under active hostile fire, resulting in the successful extraction of 41 American personnel and Allied civilians. No one whispered. No one shifted. The room had stopped breathing. I was carried backward whether I wanted to be or not. Izmir had smelled of smoke and concrete dust. The alarms screaming so loudly they became part of the air. Lieutenant Grayson bleeding against the communications wall. Commander Patel down 30 seconds earlier. Command mine, not because I wanted it, because everyone else was gone. Fear had come then, sharp and clean, the kind that narrows your whole world to the next right decision. Dragging a wounded diplomat down a stairwell slick with blood. Forcing my own shaking hands to stay steady enough to get civilians onto extraction transport. And afterward, sitting alone in the transport hold while my entire body trembled so hard I could barely breathe. That was heroism in real life. Not glory. Just terror endured, one decision at a time. Halstead lowered the page. Then he rose, slowly, deliberately, and removed his robe again. Beneath it he stood straight back despite his age. Every inch the Naval Reserve officer he had once been. He faced me and saluted. Crisp. Deliberate. Solemn. All rise for Commander Abigail Mercer, United States Navy, in recognition of extraordinary service to this nation. The room stood as one. Every person. The bailiff, the clerk, Mrs. Chandler, Sheriff Collins. Daniel. And my father, trembling now, staring at me as if seeing his daughter for the first time. I rose and returned the salute. Steady hand. Locked elbow. Eyes forward. When Halstead sat again, only my father remained standing. His lips moved soundlessly before the words finally came. This isn't possible. It is possible, Mr. Mercer. Then Margaret stood. Your Honor, the defense has one final witness. The side door opened. Thomas Keegan, Daniel's former business partner, walked in carrying a banker's box of records. The moment my brother saw him, his composure collapsed completely. Thomas had been Daniel's closest friend once. Now he walked to the witness stand without looking at him. That alone said enough. He testified plainly. Inflated contracts. Fabricated collateral. Private loans secured against family land. $4.8 million in hidden debt. Signed off by both my father and my brother. My father turned toward Daniel. You told me 200,000. Daniel swallowed. Said nothing. Margaret asked Thomas why he'd come forward now. He looked toward me. Because Eleanor Mercer once told me that truth has a way of waiting patiently until people are finally ready to hear it. The room went still at the mention of her name. That sounded exactly like her. Judge Halstead set down the documents. This court finds in favor of the defendant. Ownership rights remain equally vested under Eleanor Mercer's amended will. Furthermore, this court refers evidence of financial fraud to the Commonwealth Attorney for criminal review. Daniel slumped into his chair. My father didn't move. I stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. Father looked at me, still flushed with whatever desperate righteousness he had left. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant of my childhood. Not as the man whose approval had once defined my worth. Just an aging, frightened man who had mistaken possession for love so many times he no longer knew the difference. It was never yours to protect, I said quietly. He froze. It was yours to love. Silence settled. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. The kind that comes when something undeniable has finally been said aloud. The anger drained from his face all at once, leaving only age and grief and something like shame. That evening we sat together on the farmhouse porch as September light faded over the Blue Ridge. The porch swing still hung from its chains near the far rail. Mother's swing. My father spoke haltingly, honestly, for perhaps the first time. He told me I had always looked like her. That I had her way of seeing a better world than the one in front of her. That somewhere along the way, he had started resenting anything that reminded him she saw farther than he did. When you left, he said, I heard her voice in yours. And I knew if you went, you'd prove something I'd spent my whole life refusing to admit. That this land wasn't enough. I shook my head slowly. You never understood her. No. He looked at his hands. I didn't. The honesty of it surprised me more than any apology could have. I reached into my jacket and placed her letter in his lap. He stared at the handwriting and went perfectly still. She knew, I said. He nodded, unable to speak. I rose. The night had deepened fully around us. Stars gathering over the fields. I'm going to visit her in the morning, I said. He looked up. Would you tell her? He couldn't finish. I gave a single nod and walked down the porch steps into the dark, leaving my father alone with the truth my mother had written years before he was finally ready to read it. 3 months later, Cedar Ridge Veterans Retreat opened its doors on the Mercer land. Daniel had taken the business assets to pay legal settlements and left Virginia shortly after. My father remained on the farm. We spoke occasionally, briefly, carefully. Healing, I had learned, rarely arrives all at once. It moves the way roots move underground, quiet and invisible and slow. He began volunteering at the retreat without explanation. Repairing fence rails, fixing plumbing, mowing the grounds. Service in the language he had always understood best. That was enough. On opening day, our first guest arrived. Retired Army Sergeant Walter Hensley, 78 years old, Vietnam veteran, hands trembling slightly from Parkinson's. He stepped onto the porch of Cottage 3 and looked out over the fields for a long moment. Then he turned to me. I haven't felt peace this quiet in 40 years, he said. I stood there with him and let the silence hold what words could not. After a while he smiled. You know, the strongest people I ever knew weren't the loud ones. He looked out at the fields. They were the ones who stopped needing to prove who they were. I thought of my mother instantly. That evening, I stood alone on the main porch and watched the light go copper and slow across Cedar Ridge. Laughter drifted from the dining hall behind me. Soft, real, earned. And I finally understood what honor meant. It was never the uniform. Not really. Not the medals or salutes or classified commendations buried in Pentagon files. Those things mattered, but they were symbols. Honor lived somewhere quieter. In truth told late, but told anyway. In wounds carried without bitterness. In choosing to build where others once tried to break. That day in court, everyone rose because of the uniform I wore. But I finally stood because I no longer needed it to know my worth.